Chapter 25. Dare punted one of the cultists' loose heads out of her way, but it bit hard into the leather on her boot and clung to it. She hopped for balance as she whacked at the chewing head with her sword. She shook it off just as something sharp and heavy clipped her already bleeding shoulder. She cursed and jumped away, whirling around to face the new opponent. She tried not to flinch as the shrieking horse-like beast reared and pointed hooves rose above her. She thrust at the pale animal. Her sword skidded off its hairless hide, leaving only a scratch. She saw blue-green veins pulsing under its skin. She wrenched herself to the side and tried again, but her sword bounced off this time, too. The Calvar struck at her with its hooves, but she jumped back. It lunged forward and chomped with its mouth. She blocked with her sword. The blade caught between its teeth, and black blood dribbled onto her steel. The beast shook its head and spat. Dare thrust for the softer skin under its jaw. She embedded the sword almost to the hilt. She grinned as the creature expired. She did it. From the corner of her eye, she espied an approaching storm reader. She tugged on her sword. It didn't budge. It was stuck tight. She wrenched it again. It moved an inch. She braced and yanked on the weapon a third time. The Kelin was now only a few paces away, his sword raised. She tensed to let go and jump out of the way when the storm reader stiffened. He gasped and toppled to the ground. The figure behind him withdrew his sword. Dare blinked and stared at Kelin. "Kelin!" She planted her foot and ripped her sword free. "You got a Kelin! Don't you dare speak to me!" He pointed his bloody blade at her. "I'm so angry with you, and I have a weapon." "Why are you mad at me?" "It's your fault I'm here!" She noticed how the blood glistened across his face like war paint. He stared at the dead beast. "We'll have to ask the captain what that was." "Calvar," she replied immediately. Kelin shot her a look. "How the hell do you know that?" She ignored him and turned toward the rest of the combat. They stood on the outer edge. There were at least 2 or 3 Kelin for every elf she saw, and the elves were isolated and scattered. A second Calvar bounded past them and gleefully tore into the biting head of the cultist Dare had kicked. Several more Calvar followed and galloped up to the base of the trees. They jumped high and, to Dare's surprise, punched their sharp hooves into the wood and began to climb. They used their momentum to keep their upward motion. Most fell, but they gnashed their teeth and started again. The elves above them cried in alarm, but they were already too busy with the Kelin. She glanced at Kelin. His sword point dropped. She gulped. "We have to find Thalin and Caleb." Blood smeared the pine needles and branches around them, but Amthros and the female Kelin didn't slow. He swiveled around the trunk and perched on the opposite limb. The storm reader followed, lunging. He waited for her to extend, then parried and flicked his blade across her arm. She grunted and hesitated. The elf grabbed a thin green branch and shoved it in her face. The Kelin caught it against her dagger and nearly sliced his hand. He forced the branch farther into her face and, with the tip of his sword, sliced her ankle. The Kelin cried aloud and stabbed down at Amthros. Her feet slid on the narrow branch they shared, and Amthros stamped hard on the base of it. The branch shuddered. The Kelin took one final thrust at him as she fell and missed by an arm's width. He turned and leaped into the next tree. He hopped down from his perch, descending quickly to the ground. He'd seen the prince fall from another tree. Several of the elves had already clustered around him, with a ring of Kelin attacking them. He smashed into them from behind, stabbing the nearest one in the spine. The Kelin briefly scattered away from him, and he was able to slip through. On the other side of the chaos, Jacob smashed his way through the storm readers, who danced out of reach of his weapon and then flowed back. Pena had materialized by the prince. The physician knelt beside Caleb and pressed a hand against the prince's forehead. "He's alive. For now. I do not know what poison they used. Is it the same as in the last war?" Jacob shrugged. "We've got to go." The dragoon knight hoisted the unconscious prince onto his shoulder. Amthros surveyed the fight one last time. "To the boats!" The remaining elves converged around them, sliding into formation. The storm readers swarmed in their unrelenting assault. The elves pushed forward in an arrowhead formation. Jacob held Caleb in the center with Amthros on point. Those in the rear fought the Kelin as they backed toward the rapids. Thalin squeezed farther inside the overturned canoe. He felt the wood scrape against his cheek as he tried to peek without being seen. Outside, sharp hooves stabbed the ground around the watercraft. He heard sniffing sounds, and the canoe shook when something bumped against it. In his hand, he gripped the knife he'd found. He remembered his mother's voice. She had explained to him many times that taking other people's things was wrong, and he felt bad for snatching the knife, but he really needed it. A hoof smashed through the canoe, striking the mud below and missing him by inches. He wound himself tighter into a ball. More hoof punches followed, pounding like falling boulders. He twisted the blade in his hand so that the tip pointed up. The Calvar's hoof came crashing through again, and Thalin heard a deep-throated gurgle. He released his fingers from the knife's handle and pried them up from the earth. The Calvar had driven the pommel far into the mud, and the blade had disappeared up into the bottom of the hoof. The Calvar screamed and reared. Through the holes in the canoe, Thalin watched the beast pounding its hoof against the ground to attempt to dislodge the knife. The animal's head dipped forward at an odd angle. Then it stopped moving. Black blood splattered onto the canoe and boy. Someone kicked the body over. Thalin saw a shape standing there with a sword in one hand and a knife in the other. The figure bent over the boat. Thistle lifted off the remnants of the boat and raised Thalin up in an arm. The elves didn't stop as the Calvar charged in front of the canoes, trapping them between the beasts on one side and the Kelin on the other. Amthros strained to keep himself from jumping ahead and leaving formation. He cut a gash in the flank of the nearest Calvar. It screamed, spun around, and kicked out with both back hooves. He dodged, but it slowed the entire rank. Another 2 Calvar joined in. The elves marched shoulder to shoulder with him. He could hear the clashing of metal behind him as those in the rear defended against the Kelin, but they fought cautiously, he had to remind himself, and they'd never expose their own necks unless they were sure of victory. "Now!" he bellowed. He and the other elves in front lunged together. The Calvar screamed, bit, and kicked against the swords. Several reared, flailing with their sharpened hooves. Amthros sliced deeply into the exposed underside of the nearest hoof. That Calvar roared and skittered to the side. Behind him, Jacob held his axe up, ready to cut down anything that got through the line. The prince on his shoulder hadn't stirred at all. Next to him, Pena pressed his fingers against the prince's neck. "Keep breathing! If you can hear me, keep breathing!" They continued their advance toward the canoes, squeezing the Calvar off to the side. Several of the screaming animals splashed backward into the river, where the current snatched them away.